Activism begins in outrage. Douglass understood this acutely. He pulled no punches when describing slavery. Interestingly, Garrison, who was the strict pacifist, was the more polemical writer, perhaps to make up for his ardent principles. Though Douglass thought John Brown, had been reckless, he became increasingly in favor, or at least saw the necessity of, a violent end to slavery. And Garrison and himself would have a falling out over the issue. Douglass does condemn slave owners, but more importantly, he humanizes the slave. Fiction will play an important role in abolition. Again, I must highlight the importance of not just talking about a problem, but humanizing the victims. In this way, I would argue Charles Dickens is as important as Marx, in so far as the labor movements around the world. But Douglass, I would argue, is a better writer. And this might be an unfair analysis since I've never read Dickens. It's just that every adaptation of Dickens I've ever seen is a little sentimental and sometimes over the top. Douglass stripped sentimentality from his works. Reading his books is much more akin to Schindler's List or 12 Years a Slave. The villains of Dickens are always bordering on the comedic. One remembers the more gruel scene from Oliver Twist. It's a bit too mustache twirling. Whereas Douglass shows how the system of slavery corrupts the soul. Miss Auld, for example, starts off very nice, but with some stern instruction by her husband on the dangers of teaching a slave, she slowly descends into darkness and becomes increasingly callous. I would have enjoyed more thorough inspection, but the fact remains that villains in literature up until this point in time had always been one-dimensional. I suspect this might be because this is the first in-depth autobiography I've ever read, and therefore the depictions are inevitably going to be more realistic than an imagined world. One's in an imagined world. When African American culture is fully understood, I'm not sure how anybody can look with the same interest at the history of white people in the United States. I know that sounds racist, but the fact of the matter is, African Americans have far more gravitas to their struggle. They were a people without land or money and yet fought back against those oppressing them. Douglass himself says as much regarding Patrick Henry. As black history is explored in our society, I'm not sure white history can hold a candle to it. When talking about history, it should really be told from the perspective of African Americans and Native Americans. You might claim that they make up a minority of the population, to which I would respond, every person talked about in history represents only a minority of the people who make up history. Beyond the history factors, we only pick a select few people to talk about. You might say white people contributed a lot to history, like airplanes. But it's really the airplane, isn't it? Not the people who invented it that are the subject of the story. You don't really care about the Wright brothers aside from them inventing the airplane. But when we talk about slavery, we need to talk about the slaves, how they were affected, their personal lives, and how much suffering they had to go through. There really is no history of white people. Only events that happen to involve white people. But those events could have easily occurred with black people. But slavery was an event which was relegated to black people by law. There is nothing about white culture, if such a thing even exists, that revolves around airplanes. But black culture is defined by fighting oppression. Even their music plays a role in this narrative. Even the colleges and educations of blacks. All of this revolves around gaining freedom. There is no overriding narrative that ties white people together in the United States. You're either a WASP or one of the countless white ethnic groups. Getting back to Douglass, you can see an interesting dialectic emerge between slave and master, prey and predator. The slave master kept his slaves in line by arbitrary brutality and spontaneous arrival on the scene. In depictions about slaves, we often see an overseer in the field watching over the slaves. But according to Douglass, that was rarely the case, or at least the best way to keep slaves in line was by going away and then coming back randomly, because then the slaves would always be on edge. Douglass talks about how white people also posed as abolitionists, offering freedom to slaves and then punishing them when they accepted, in order to get the slaves to refrain from escaping. A lot of slaves did commit suicide. You might think the value of a slave would prevent a slave owner from driving his slaves to suicide, but if you're a wealthy slave owner, it's really not that much of an issue. The best description from Douglass comes across as the work camps in Schindler's List. When talking about African Americans as a people of spontaneous generation, it's important to recognize that under the setting of slavery, African Americans not only had to outsmart the oppressor, but also had to contend among the quibbles of several masters. Since all white people in the South were by law and custom above black people, and since white people often quarreled among each other, black people found one of the biggest weapons was to study the psychology of white people and exploit it, while at the same time finding solidarity amongst themselves. In terms of conflict, when we consider the births of other civilizations and cultures, there was already a solidarity in the way you fight by banding together. With the constant threat of the auction block, black associations in America were never certain. There is no family but the one you make, and the constant ripping apart of these associations creates an individual prepared for new situations and alliances. The psychology of this type of individual is somebody who's far more flexible, resilient, and adventurous. It also gives this person greater appreciation for a fixed foundation. This aspect of black culture would remain after slavery as a result of the Great Migration, meaning that families separated in the North and the South were separated, but as a result of things like the Green Book, travel was discovered. And this ability to travel covertly would be used as a weapon against Jim Crow when the bus boycott happened. Black people were, by building up separate communities, could finally detach themselves from whites who relied on them, and by doing so undermined white power structure and brought an end to overt white supremacy. In short, white society couldn't cope with the sudden change when black people departed from their buses. Black culture was the sustainer of any kind of white hierarchy. They didn't have either the psychological or the physical means to deal with a world without black people, while black people had, over time, built an independent existence for themselves. It's also why the Confederacy fell. White people need black people to work for them. That's how white supremacy functions. Black people don't need white people. And when black people developed ways, such as the Green Book, to safely traverse a racist society, they were able to combat that racism. Prior to the Green Book, the Underground Railroad existed, which would also lead to the collapse of slavery. Whereas most societies and cultures are fixed in a certain location, black communities became far-flung and flexible, but tied by a circulation of individuals.